Hi, my name is Rex Pruitt. I am the Hadoop Technical Advisor working in the Customer Success Organization as a systems engineer. In this video, we're going to be discussing what SAS interactions with Hadoop can be done. Here's a list of all the software that fits with Hadoop. There's SAS products and offerings and technologies, and they're all enabled to work with Hadoop. A special note is that some of these capabilities are contingent upon your SAS license agreement. But our focus today is going to be on the SAS access interface to Hadoop. While that is our focus, item number 3, I did want to mention items number 1 and 2 allow for an interaction with Hadoop using base SAS techniques. So with your base SAS license, you can do a file name statement and interact with the data in HDFS, or you can use proc Hadoop, which allows you to execute MapReduce and HDFS commands in the Hadoop cluster. An example of that might be a make directory or a copying files or something such as that. But again, our focus in this presentation will be the SAS Access Engine. And what I just said is here in writing for you, so you can capture the screenshot for your reference. So how does Hadoop work with the SAS Access Engine? Well, when a connection is made to the Hadoop cluster using a live name statement to Hadoop, that makes the connection to the Hive server in the Hadoop cluster. That allows SAS to push down HiveQL in database and execute in the Hadoop environment and leverage the distributed processing capabilities and power in the HiveQL processing environment. So what does that look like from an architecture standpoint, and how does that work? Well, SAS, again, connects directly into the Hive server in the Hadoop cluster, and it does this through a JDBC driver. And when the SAS Access Engine is invoked, it makes your Hive tables look to you as a SAS user like any other SAS data set in your user interface when you're interacting with that data. It also allows you to do bulk loads directly into HDFS from SAS data sets. And then there's the capability to read directly from HDFS as well. Here's a logical view of the SAS Access Engine and its interface into the Hive server or the Hadoop cluster Hive server. You'll notice here the Hadoop configuration and jar files are referenced on the SAS client machine. Well, those also exist in the Hadoop cluster, and they have to match. They have to be the same versions and such, so that that handshake, this two-way street, if you will, can be established so that those interactions between the SAS environment or SAS client and the Hadoop name node are successful. That leads us to a discussion about the way SAS does interact with Hadoop in the context of scripting or the code. And there's two different ways that it happens, and there's an implicit SQL method and an explicit SQL method. So we'll talk briefly about that, and then we'll hit on the SAS functions and why it's important to understand which functions are allowed, and then we'll mention briefly the 5 procedures that you can use to run in database that generate that implicit SQL. So here we are, implicit SQL. What's the difference? Well, here's an example of a proc SQL set of SAS code, a pretty simple piece of logic and syntax, and this is what the SAS Access Engine will rewrite it into. And then here are the options that need to be turned on during your session so that the bottom portion of this screen, or the translated or rewritten SAS code into HiveQL, will display in the SAS log. The SAS trace option, here is a slide that shows what I prefer in my SAS code. So I add the S on the end of the D, just so I get some additional DBMS stat information. Here's an example of a SAS log that I ran using cars data. I bulk loaded that into Hadoop and ran this piece of SQL code, and it translated it into this HiveQL code, and then I got this statement, which was that the Access engine actually processed and passed the code, or that rewritten code in HiveQL, down into the DBMS, or the Hadoop cluster, and fetched the data. And this is what we want to happen, is process in database and not perform a select star and send the data back over to SAS client. Now that was implicit. Here is an example of explicit pass-through code. You execute the code a little differently. Instead of simply writing a SAS program of proc SQL, you would have to do a connect to Hadoop, which is getting the handshake with Hadoop, or that two-way communication, and then you would execute HiveQL within the parenthetical execute statement by Hadoop. So using that handshake or that connect to, you have to tell the code, use that connection and submit this code, and it will in fact run in database. One drawback to this is you do not get information surfaced back into the log through the SAS trace for push-down SQL, or this pass-through SQL explicit. The reason is because you're turning it over to the Hadoop cluster for execution, and if the execution cannot run for whatever reason, a syntax problem or whatever, it's not going to offer any suggestions about what the problem might be. It'll just say it didn't work. I prefer to use implicit SQL because I'm not a HiveQL programmer. Regarding the SAS functions that are required to be used or allowed to be used in implicit SQL, so you're writing your implicit SQL and you're going to pass a function down. For example, the trim function here, we have trim in is the SAS function, and then in the parenthetical, it's what it gets translated into when the Access engine is rewriting the code into HiveQL. So these are all accepted functions. So you need to reference this list to make sure that your SQL query, if you're writing implicit SQL, that it passes that code down into the database. And of course, if you run a little test on it, you'll get a result back, and it'll let you know in the log if it ran in database or if it sent the query back over to SAS for processing. Now, there's some exceptions that need to be considered in respect to dates. Date information is stored as text in the Hadoop cluster, so you have to really check your results to make sure you're getting the expected result when you use date functions. This slide is to show the 5 procedures that can be pushed down into the Hadoop cluster for processing. So these 5 procedures, freak, rank, report, summary, means, and tabulate. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm not going to mention sort because it really doesn't produce statistics. The others do, and there are some exceptions to the statistics that can be returned. So you'll need to look at the actual documentation for that procedure to find out which statistics can be run in database. For example, you cannot do a percentile because of the distributed nature of the data. So if you request a percentile in one of these procedures, it'll send all of the data back over to SAS to process, because the Access engine cannot translate that particular option into HiveQL and process in a distributed environment. So it has to send it back to the SAS client for processing. We don't want that to happen, if at all possible. We only want to send our result set back to SAS for further analytics. That is the conclusion of this segment. Thank you for watching the video presentation. And should you have any questions, please reach out to me directly, or you can contact your customer success manager or account executive